So it's 4:35 Berlin time, so I guess we can get started with breakout session on topic number 3. So in this session, we're talking about public acceptance for water reuse, which Dr. Marie Raffin already named as challenge number 2 at the beginning of the talks that started the day today. In this session, we're going to hear from our 2 speakers who have addressed this topic at both the large and the local scales. And as you all know, public acceptance can often make or break a reuse project. So my hope for this session is that you can leave with actionable insights on how to steer public acceptance in such a way so that we can increase the implementation of reuse projects in Europe and worldwide. So before we start, even though I think you've heard this before, I'd like to remind you that, or tell you how this breakout session is structured. First, we're actually going to hear from Dr. Heather Smith, whose presentation will be directly followed by Peter Asterberg. During the presentations, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. And after Peter finishes, we can have a round of questions and discussion altogether. As previously mentioned, feel free to either submit your questions in the chat or directly ask your questions to the presenters themselves. And at that point, you can also turn on your cameras. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Heather Smith, a senior lecturer at Cranfield University in the UK. Dr. Smith has extensive experience working in both European and international projects. And today she's going to be discussing how global public acceptance of water reuse and shedding light on which factors affect the uptake of reuse scenarios. She'll also speak about the recent acceptance rates of reuse practices in Europe and what this means for the future of reuse. Heather, please start when you're ready.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and thanks a lot again for the invitation to present today. Just share my screen as you do. Is that all right?
I can see it, yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about a little bit of, some global insights, I suppose, on the some of the general research that's been done around the world on public acceptance of water reuse and where some of the current thinking on that is. I'll also talk about some of the recent work that we've done as part of a European project looking at acceptance in different European countries. And it's a long-standing interest. That photo there is it's one of my favorite photos of this. It's from an art installation in California where they installed a drinking fountain on a toilet and put it in a gallery as part of a way of prompting people to rethink where the water came from. The water itself was not recycled water. It was just normal tap water, but it was a way of challenging people's perceptions of it, getting them to think beyond it. So this understanding of how people react to recycled water and the prospect of it has been a long-standing interest. We know from the discussions we've had, some of the previous presentations, that there are many challenges, also opportunities, but many challenges facing the expansion and added uptake of water reuse schemes. The infrastructure around sewage collection and treatment, particularly in developing countries, can be a challenge. There are financial challenges, regulatory challenges that we've discussed in depth and are hopefully being addressed somewhat in Europe through the new water reuse regulation. But there are a number of challenges, not just public acceptance, that face this. But I think public acceptance has long been seen as a potential barrier. There are a number of famous cases where reuse schemes have been shelved or killed off as a result of negative public reactions towards it. So that's part of the reason we've done some more exploration work in this space. And part of it goes back as long as we've had sewer systems in some ways. I mean, this fine-looking gentleman is Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who's the sort of well known as the architect of the modern day sewage systems that sort of began in London. And he designed London's first large-scale sewer system. And this was one of sort of his famous quotes in it, that we were trying to divert something that causes mischief to somewhere where it can cause no mischief. So divert sewage away from public view and from public interaction. So this view that sewage should always be, that it is something fundamentally of mischief, and that it should be fundamentally taken away, is at the core of how we've designed our wastewater systems. And that in itself is a very challenging view to overcome, because it's a very embedded form of thinking. And but it does change, it can change. So one of the sort of famous examples of an attempt to alter public views of recycled water and of potable recycled water in particular was in San Diego, that has invested quite a lot in this. So San Diego is one of the cities that has previously had a scheme, potable reuse scheme, that was first proposed in the late 1990s, I believe, but it was it was shelved as a result after a local election because of public reaction to it. It became an election issue. And after that, the sort of proposal for this potable reuse scheme didn't go away. It was kind of re-proposed sort of towards the early to mid 2000s. But this time they invested masses in a very extensive public engagement campaign. And this is just some of the things that they did as part of that public engagement campaign. One of the sort of keystones of that engagement campaign was this demonstration project that was at a sort of a smallish scale, but they were very transparent about the results of that demonstration project and did a lot of tours and outreach directly from that demonstration project. And all of these things effectively worked. There was a shift in public perceptions towards it that could be seen, and you can see it most clearly in this strongly opposed category here, where when they did the survey in the mid 2000s, there was a considerable proportion who were strongly opposed to it, and then by sort of 2012, that had dropped considerably, and support had grown considerably. So in this case, it worked. There has been a shift in public acceptance towards it, and now the city is in the process of rolling out very large scale. It's called Pure Water San Diego, and it's a very large scale potable drinking water scheme. But you can see from the timings that this was a very long-term process, from sort of the mid 2000s up to present day. Basically, it's still going on. And this is sort of an indication of their current approvals, and the scale of the project that they're currently putting in place. So things can shift, but it can take quite a long time. So what's underpinning this, and from some of the previous work that's been done around the world, there's obviously there's an element of emotional reaction to it. Disgust, it's often referred to as the yuck factor, and a lot of work that's been done around this sort of labels it as kind of a precognitive reaction. So it's a reaction, an emotional reaction that takes place before you've really had a chance to think about it. And so it's not the product of a rational evaluation of evidence. It's a gut feeling, it's a gut reaction. And that has obviously strongly played a role in how people react to this. This can be seen in how reactions change depending on the closeness of contact. So it's well documented that uses of recycled water that have less contact are generally more accepted, drinking being the one that has the closest level of contact and is therefore often the most controversial. That also kind of stems from the perceived closeness of the water you're drinking or coming into contact with sewage as an origin, and people can struggle to disassociate those things in their heads, even if rationally they can understand they're different. That emotional reaction can still make them seem quite close. On top of that, there can be health risk perceptions, particularly as awareness has grown around some of the things we've heard earlier, the fate of microplastics, the fate of pharmaceutical contaminants, things like that. So those can add to perceived health risks. And again, we've heard today that experience of water stress or being in a region that is prone to water stress can affect acceptance of it. And that there is a general trend, and it's true that where water reuse is most commonly practiced tends to be in areas of the world where there are significant water stresses, like in Spain or the southwest of the US, California again being a common example. So I think that is a trend, but it's not always the case. So Australia was one of the famous examples where, despite having suffered a drought, there was actually quite strong sentiment against water reuse. So this doesn't always hold true. There's an element of trust in not just the utilities that provide the service, but also the authorities that oversee them, and whether they can altogether provide a safe service.
And around 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll wrap up. And a perception that social norms, so a perception of what other people do and accept, can affect whether you want to do it. So I'll just quickly say that the media can have a role in this. And this was a set of headlines that came from when it was proposed in London. And one of the most stark things about these headlines was that they all portrayed it slightly differently. Most of them talked about treated sewage. One of them, as you can see, didn't even bother with the word treated and just said, would you drink sewage? So there can be an effect of how the media portrays this and whether they enhance that level of closeness to sewage that I mentioned earlier. But I'll just quickly go through the survey I mentioned. We've done these recent large-scale surveys in the UK, the Netherlands, and Spain, and this was done in 2019 and 2020, so before the recent COP. And they explored these attitudes towards potable reuse and nutrient recovery to grow food, which also included some of the use of effluent for irrigation that we've talked about. And one of the most dramatic things that came out of this was that support was quite high for both practices. And obviously you can see there the difference between the different countries. We saw some of the highest support in Spain, unsurprisingly, given the length of time that water reuse has been practiced in that country. There were a number of things we looked at in terms of what was influencing these reactions to water reuse and nutrient recovery. Social norms did seem to be playing quite a strong reaction. So whether or not people feel that others around them would accept it. And these emotional reactions seem to have a strong role. Things that didn't come out as having as strong a role as we would have thought were things like the perceptions of a water scarcity challenge, as well as the sort of perceived environmental benefit. These kinds of things had a role, but not as strong a role as we would have thought. The two I've mentioned came out as much stronger. So as I said, there's a lot that we could talk about in that survey, but I will leave it there for now and happily take questions after the next presenter.
Great. Thanks a lot, Heather. Thanks also for keeping time. And as mentioned, those of you in the audience, please save your questions then for the end, so we can have a discussion, hopefully with going into the results of NextGen and also from what Peter will tell us in the next talk. So our second speaker is Peter Esterberg, an infrastructure project manager at Norconsult in Sweden. Peter has extensive on-the-ground experience in water reuse, both from the consulting and from the municipality perspectives. Today, he'll give us a peek into the timeline of what it took to successfully implement Europe's first direct potable reuse project in southern Sweden, focusing on the technical aspects as well as the public acceptance. So Peter, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining this session. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will present a new drinking water plant in Sweden. it's a plant that produces municipal drinking water from a blend of brackish seawater and reused industrial water. I was the project manager for the planning and construction of this plant a few years ago. After a short presentation of the plant, a very short presentation, I will focus on the public acceptance for the reused water. Mörbylånga municipality covers the southern part of this island in the Baltic Sea. It's called Öland. The Baltic Sea is a brackish sea, which means the salinity is much lower than in the oceans. For many years, the island has experienced water stress because there are no surface water sources and very small groundwater sources too. And also it's a very popular vacation destination. In 2016, drinking water was transported with tank trucks from the Swedish mainland. So the situation reached a critical point, and this was the starting point for this project. A completely new drinking water plant that was fully commissioned only in May this year. It's a plant that will be independent of rainfall and groundwater recharge, as it treats a varying mix of brackish water and industrial water. The plant will be used in addition to existing groundwater plants to ensure drinking water supply, even for very long periods of rainfall shortage. It's also the first plant for potable reuse in Sweden. This illustration shows the main steps for the treatment and for the reuse of the water. So number one, brackish water is drawn from several drilled close to the Baltic Sea. And then the water is led to the drinking water plant, where it's treated with ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis for desalination, ultraviolet light, and chlorination. After treatment, the water enters the main distribution system. It goes to households and also to this food processing plant. It's a plant that consumes up to 25 to 30% of all the water that is produced in the municipality. It's one of Sweden's largest producers of chicken meat and chicken dishes. And the processed water then goes into this plant, an existing industrial wastewater treatment plant. And after treatment here, the water is approved for discharge to the Baltic Sea. But what we do now instead is that we take the water into a pre-treatment plant where the main purpose is to remove microbial content from the water. And then it re-enters the drinking water plant. So there you have the recycling circle. So how did we communicate this to the consumers? I would say the main public outreach strategy is transparency. We were always 100% transparent with our plans to reuse water. There have been several press releases, leaflet drops to all water customers in the area, many information sessions in small groups. We said from the start that we did not want any large town hall meetings where the debate could get loud and heated. Instead, we invited people to information sessions in small groups and also guided public tours. And all this has produced positive political and local support for the project. These two people here also helped to highlight the importance of the project. It's Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden and Prince Felix of Luxembourg, since the membranes were installed by a company from Luxembourg. So I said it's the first plant in Sweden to be in or for potable reuse, and it's also the first plant in Sweden ever to be in a women's magazine. This one, Svensk Damtidning, and of course because of these two. In every information session, we took the opportunity to highlight the safety measures that had been taken, especially this one. There are 7 separate microbial barriers or safety barriers. They either remove or inactivate viruses, bacteria, and other microorganisms, and we call it an excess of safety. I also often ask this question in the presentations, is water reuse a new phenomenon? I think another speaker has already mentioned it today, the de facto reuse. That the case is often, at least in Sweden, that different towns, they use the water after each other. And when you get to this point, maybe 30 to 40% of the water has already been used further up in the system. So how have people reacted to these plans? We have had, of course, a few negative voices. This is a letter to a newspaper, a woman that said, "I'm not looking forward to the Mörbylånga cocktail at all." The Mörbylånga cocktail was the blend, the mix of waters. This one says, technology cannot replace natural purification. And here's a question too. Have you forgotten about Murphy's Law? Remember Harrisburg, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Anything that can go wrong will sooner or later go wrong. There were no responses at all to this one or to this one. You can see here, there are 4 comments to this one. So they stand quite alone. But there are negative voices. But also a lot of positive coverage. Here you see what I mentioned before, an excess of safety will provide clean drinking water. It was a local newspaper who had this article. This is about innovative technology, a water plant that is unique in the world. I like this one. We were called global pioneers. So you could say we not only wanted that our customers would accept the water, we actually wanted them to feel proud of the plant, the innovative water plant. We received a few prizes, the Water Reuse Europe Innovation Prize 2019 and the Silent Prize 2020. We had a lot of guided tours, of course, the inauguration, the royal inauguration. Yeah. And that's all, I think. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. That I think the thing I took away from the presentation was that the plant was featured in a women's magazine. So maybe this also is a secret weapon in the portfolio of what we can do to improve public acceptance of water reuse policies.
Maybe.
Who knew?
Unfortunately, they didn't mention water reuse or reverse osmosis. They only mentioned the 2 royals and the water plant, of course. Yeah.
Okay. It's a start.
It's a start, yeah.
Great. So we're doing really good on time. Both of you stuck very sharply to the 10-minute limit. So let's start with the question round. And Heather, I'd like to start with you. You just briefly talked about the survey that you guys conducted in NextGen, but maybe you could give us a bit more information about, or maybe we could also see the slides one more time, just to see the percentage of acceptance, and give us a bit more information about what you think that actually means for the future of water reuse in Europe.
Yeah, thanks. So hopefully you can see the slide again. I think what it means is when you take it in the context of previous work that's been done, particularly I'm most familiar with work that's been done in the UK, we do seem to be seeing a trend in improving acceptance. Now this is just sort of one indication, but the fact that it was a fair bit higher than we anticipated as far as the acceptance, particularly for the potable drinking water. But I think it means that public perception is possibly no longer the barrier that it might be, or it might have once been. That's not to say that we will never see negative reactions. Obviously, even from what Peter was saying, that you do get negative voices, but it may be less of a concern and less of a sort of potential barrier to the adoption of schemes. And certainly from what we've seen in other parts of the world, and even from Peter's example, that investment in outreach and engagement can have quite a strong impact.
Do you think that also the buzz about the new EU minimum water reuse requirement regulation, as well as the requirements that Bernd mentioned to communicate to the public that are written into the regulation, do you think that this will also have an effect on public acceptance? And
I hope so, yes. I think it's a really positive step that it's specifically written in the regulation that it needs to be communicated. I think that's been something that's been demonstrated over and over again, that it certainly helps. And the more examples we see of it, and I think this is where the sort of social norms part comes in. The fact that social norms seem to play such a strong role in determining people's responses, the more it's kind of perceived as something that other people are getting behind, the more you kind of can get to that critical mass of it becoming sort of a standard accepted process. So I think the more examples like Peter's and like others that we've heard about today, the more these kind of examples get publicized and communicated more broadly, that should start to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Peter's example, maybe Peter can also share us or give us a bit more insight on why. So I know that the commissioning process began, I think, in 2016. So already 6 years ago or 5 years ago. Back then, why did you choose already to go to water reuse? And why didn't you stick with just going for a desalination plant? Wouldn't that have been easier?
Yeah, it would have been easier. It's true. I think the main driving force was a feeling of sustainability that the water department in the municipality saw that 25-30% of all the drinking water that was produced every day in the municipality went through this one plant and then out in the Baltic Sea. And was destroyed as drinking water. So they had a feeling for a long time that they wanted to take that water back. And at that time, maybe the plan was to take it back for reuse in the food processing plant. But when we made some pilot testing and we saw that the water was, the process to desalinate water and to reuse the water was very similar. So then we decided, why not make potable water from this reused water? So, and the process, the planning started in 2016, and the desalination part was commissioned in 2019. And then we had to work a little more with the reuse scheme.
And did you, so from the beginning, did you tell us, kind of walk us through the timeline of when you really started to do this public outreach for the public acceptance? Did it begin also in 2016? Was it only happening after you started more concretely developing the water reuse practice, or how did that unfold?
Yeah, I found an article in a newspaper from 2016, October somewhere in 2016, and that was the first time that the plans to reuse water was mentioned, I think. So it was part of the plans and part of the information during the whole project. Yeah.
And did you, was it also, how to put this, developed together with the community, or did you find some sort of guidelines from other reuse projects in the US or in Australia, for example? As mentioned before, we don't have as much reuse in Europe as there is elsewhere.
No, there are no guidelines at all in Sweden for water reuse. So I looked a lot at the US Environment and Protection Agency. Sorry, I thought I turned my phone off before this. And also the WHO guidelines for water reuse.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's quite difficult also for us to implement, to think about implementing such projects, because there's so few good examples in the EU. But with your project, as well as with multiple projects that we've heard of today, I think that this should hopefully increase. And Heather, I wanted to ask maybe your opinion on, with the promising results that you guys have seen in NextGen from your surveys, do you still think that public acceptance is a barrier for further water reuse schemes in Europe?
No, I think, well, yeah, not to say that it will never be, it's never a barrier, but that I think the bigger barrier is a fear of public acceptance in some ways. So a lot of utilities or governments even have been in the past sort of reluctant to support reuse because they think there will be a negative public reaction. And it's that perception of perception almost that's more of the barrier than the actual public reactions themselves, I think is what we're seeing. That if there's a kind of a positive narrative around it, particularly one like in Peter's reaction that, you know, really builds strongly on the you know, the sort of sense of pride that can come with a scheme like this, and builds that positive, which is one of the ways that can really sort of challenge that emotional reaction that I talked about in my presentation. You sort of challenge that with building a positive emotional association to the scheme, and if the more we see some of those, the more we can see the kind of positive impact that the demonstration schemes can have. And yeah, so I think fear of public reaction is probably more of a barrier now than public reaction itself.
And the survey, that the 3 countries that you conducted the survey in are, I would say, quite different in their water stress levels. Maybe could you explain a bit about why they were chosen, and if you think this affects then their responses, basically? Yeah,
I mean, obviously we were trying to choose countries that were diverse, as you say, in their experiences of implementing water reuse already. So we did want to have a country that was quite experienced in doing water reuse, like Spain, and some countries that were sort of, I guess, further behind. In the UK, we have very little in the way of water reuse. So we wanted to see if we could tackle that diversity of experience and diversity of geographical context as well, in terms of what are the various, what might the perceptions of water stress be and local water stress be. So we tried to, it was partly through just trying to get that diversity that we chose those 3 countries. We wouldn't argue that our results from these 3 countries are going to be universally representative of all of Europe. Certainly there's a lot more work that could be done on that front, but I think it's quite a good snapshot of some quite different contexts.
I think one thing I also noticed in both of your presentations is that quite often, so public acceptance, when it leads to acceptance of a reuse project, it often starts quite early on in the process, but it can often cost also quite a lot of money. And so I would ask actually for both of your opinions on whether or not you think it always needs to cost a lot of money, maybe how much money or how much of % of a project budget would be wise for future reuse projects to allocate already at the beginning for something like this, or kind of just in general advice from both of your research perspective as well as the practical perspective of kind of the first steps to think about when you want to make sure that the public accepts your project. Maybe we can start with Heather and then go on to Peter.
Yes, it's fairly challenging to put it to a kind of figure on it. Yes, the what's been done so far is often has often been quite expensive. So I think in San Diego, certainly they invested quite heavily in it. But it's paid dividends for them, I think, as far as what they're able to do now with their potable reuse scheme. Whether or not it needs to cost a certain percentage or whether or not it needs to always be expensive, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case now. I mean, again, I think the more projects that happen and the more cases they see, or the more cases that pop up, I think that's when it will start to become less expensive in some ways, because as partly we have to invest quite heavily in it here because it's not done very frequently. Mm-hmm. And where it has been done, it's not very well known, so except in the local community. So I think that it will start to become less expensive the more projects we see. But yeah, for some of these projects, it will inevitably cost something, and that the cost of doing some public engagement will always have to be factored in to the early stages of the project, certainly.
Mm-hmm. But then maybe the requirement, again, that's written into the regulation that mandates the communication will also serve to kind of provide sort of an encyclopedia of all the water reuse practices already occurring.
Sure.
And then serve to convince people of new approaches or new installations.
I think one other thing I'll just add to that quickly is I think it partly depends on what level of public engagement the utility has anyway. So if the utility is already very experienced at talking to customers about most things, then it probably won't be much of an add-on cost to talk about the specific project. If they're sort of starting from scratch altogether with not having a lot of public engagement experience, then it's going to be more. But yes, I think there are examples, hopefully, to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Heather, you mentioned public trust in authorities. And I think in Sweden, the trust in authorities is maybe unusually high. People trust authorities a lot, and we often do as the authorities tells us. It's not very common with the large demonstrations against decisions, and so the trust is already high. And I think most of the reactions that we got, you saw this one with the Mörbylånga cocktail, and yeah, it's as you said, it's emotional reactions before you even know what we're planning is sometimes it looked like people thought they were going to drink the processed water as it was. For example, we never used words like from toilet to tap, or we always mentioned reused water, reclaimed water. Yeah. So it's important, I think, how you talk about the scheme. And I agree, the more schemes we will see in Europe and other parts of the world, the less the cost will be for public outreach.
Mm-hmm. Would you also, do you think that maybe also the high public acceptance you experienced in your case was due to the fact that in such a small municipality, it's possible to have many small meetings, as opposed to, for example, in San Diego, multi-million, I think, population in San Diego. It would probably take many years to go through with very small meetings.
Yeah, absolutely, that's correct. But as small as possible.
Mm-hmm. And with so you've had now, correct me if I'm wrong, you've had now 2 years of full-time operational experience, or has it been less than?
Only 6 months with the
yes.
reuse scheme. Yeah.
Have you done any comparisons between public acceptance before and now 6 months after full operation?
No, we have not.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should engage Heather to help us. Yeah.
I'd be delighted.
Yeah,
really interesting.
great. Yeah, it would be interesting. I agree. Yeah.
I have one other question, and I see that there's a hand up in the audience. So is this, since this process has been going on since 2016 with the public interaction, do you think you're at a point where you could propose using municipal wastewater in your reuse scheme? And how would the public react to this?
That's a very good question. It's actually possible because the municipal wastewater plant is situated 50 meters from the industrial plant. I don't think we are ready yet, actually. I think we need to give it a few years, but in the future, it will absolutely be possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully soon in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I see that there's a hand raised from Teresa. I don't know if you asked the question or you want to ask it, but if you want to ask it, feel free. But you are muted. We can see you, but you're muted. No.
I think there's a problem with your microphone. You are not shown as muted, but we don't hear you.
Does it work?
Now it works. Mm-hmm.
It works.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. No, I wasn't sure whether it's already fine for the audience to jump in, but I had a sort of extension question of what Ms. Ziteneva was asking, probably more towards you, Mr. Asterberg, is if we're thinking about the public engagement, on top of the finances, of course, it's also, I guess, a massive coordination and strategic effort to understand, okay, what is the way that a public utility wants to communicate? And I remember from your presentation that you were saying that the main thing you focused on was being transparent along the way. Could you elaborate a bit more, or say also what other factors maybe went into your strategy of communicating? Thanks.
Yeah, we did not spend a lot of money. The information was not very expensive. The leaflet drops, for example, cost a lot of money, but I think we invested a lot of hours, very much time talking to media, to the newspapers. Every time they called us, we went to the plant during planning, during the construction of the plant. we had a lot of local journalists there, and actually we managed to get them on our side. So if there had been a negative article or letter in the newspaper, the journalists could call me and say, how would you like to respond to this? Can I come and do a positive article about the plants now? So yeah, we spent a lot of time. There must be hundreds of hours spent on these meetings, on media, on answering emails, answering phone calls, inviting people to the plant, to information sessions. Yeah. So spend as much time as needed, I would say.
One thing I would just add to that quickly from what they did in San Diego was because I mentioned it was centered around a demonstration plant. So it was a plant that had been built at small scale, and what they really publicized were the results from that plant. So they were putting out the results continuously. People could go and look at what results, scientific results, were coming from that demonstration plant all the time. And then the other thing they did was they commissioned a panel of experts, or I think mainly academics, but I think there are some politicians in there as well. And they had them sort of review kind of their plans, the results, kind of how they were tweaking the technology, what they had planned to do. And then they were very transparent about that process as well. And they released all of the findings that the panel of experts had, fully complete. And so it was as much about kind of trusting those experts as it was in the actual hours that the operators themselves did. So it was strategies like that I think really helped in California.
Definitely. It seems like the 3 T's is something that I will come away with. So transparency, time, and trust.
Yes.
Is maybe something
that's very good. Yes.
To keep in mind about public acceptance. Yeah. Good. We are at the end of our session, but I guess we could take one more question if there is anything. If there are any coming from the audience? If not, I want to thank both of you guys very much. Public acceptance is often one of the last things that we as engineers or academics or operators or whoever think about, but it's obviously super critical for the success of projects. So hopefully maybe with these 3 T's and then the other information we learned from you guys, we'll see more and more water reuse projects in Europe in the future.
I think the 3 T's were great. You said transparency, time, and
trust.
Trust. Great. Very good.
Yes, very good.
Great. So I think we have a few minutes before we'll see each other back on the main stage. I believe it's 5:30. So I wish you all a nice coffee break, and we'll see each other back in a few minutes.